When you hear the word crime, your mind probably jumps to things like theft or maybe assault. But what about crimes that can harm entire ecosystems or even the whole planet? Well, that's the focus of a really fascinating and urgent field called green criminology, and today, that's what we're diving into.
And this brings us to a really challenging central question. What if the biggest, most destructive things happening in the world aren't actually illegal? This is the fundamental puzzle that green criminology is trying to solve.
I mean, just think about this for a second. A factory can legally pump out tons and tons of carbon, which we know contributes to climate change. But at the same time, someone who illegally dumps a single barrel of waste could face serious prosecution. Now, traditional criminology would focus only on that illegal act, but green criminology makes us stop and ask, which one of these truly causes more harm? Okay, so to really get a handle on this, we need some kind of framework. What even is a green crime? Let's start by looking at how criminologists try to categorize all these environmental harms.
A key thinker in this space, Nigel South, came up with two main categories. First up is what he calls primary green crime. This is the stuff we usually think of first, right? The direct, tangible damage. We're talking about massive deforestation that clears huge swaths of rainforest, industrial air pollution, or actions that lead directly to a species declining. It's really the front line of environmental destruction.
And then you've got the second category, secondary green crime. This is often about deception, about breaking rules to either enable or cover up that primary harm. A classic example would be a corporation that deliberately fakes its emissions data to get around regulations, or a company that illegally dumps its toxic waste in the middle of the night. It's basically the crime that makes the other crime possible.
Now, this two-part framework is a great starting point for sure, but, it's not perfect. Critics point out that it can kind of oversimplify these really complex global issues. After all, what one culture calls harm, another might just call economic development. So these simple boxes can sometimes miss that bigger, messier picture. And that global complexity is absolutely key, because these aren't just local problems. An act of pollution in one place can have major consequences thousands of miles away. And that brings us to our next big idea, the risk society.
So there's this sociologist, Ulrich Beck, who argued that the threats we face in the modern world are just different. They're not contained by geography anymore. He called this the risk society, a world where we all have to deal with these huge man-made risks like climate change or nuclear fallout that simply don't care about borders. And a powerful case study makes this concept chillingly clear.
Let's talk about Chernobyl. On April 26, 1986, there was a catastrophic explosion at a nuclear power plant in what was then the Soviet Union. On the surface, it was a local event, a terrible failure at a single facility.
But just 2 days later, poof, the whole idea of this being a local disaster just vanished. Monitoring stations in Sweden, more than 1,000 kilometers away, started picking up abnormally high levels of radiation. The risk had already crossed borders, silently and completely invisibly. And by May, the true, horrifying scale became undeniable. The radioactive fallout from that one explosion in Ukraine had spread across nearly all of Europe. It contaminated farmland, forests, and entire communities that were nowhere near the source. It was a perfect and, frankly, terrifying example of Beck's global risk.
But here's the catch with Beck's idea. Is the risk really shared by everyone equally? Critics argue that, well, no. While that radioactive cloud might drift over everyone, wealthier nations and individuals have way more resources to protect themselves. Better healthcare, food monitoring, the ability to relocate. The poor, on the other hand, often don't have those luxuries.
And that leads us to maybe the most critical part of green criminology, this deep connection between environmental harm and social inequality. Because when you ask who really pays the price for these green crimes, the answer is almost never the people who are profiting from them.
So let's just ask the question head-on. When a river gets polluted or toxic waste gets dumped, is the impact the same for a wealthy CEO living in a gated community as it is for a poor family whose home is right next to that dump site? The answer, as you can probably guess, is a huge no.
And a few key thinkers have really dug into this. Rob White says we have to focus on the harm itself, not just what's technically illegal, especially when that harm hits marginalized groups. Wolf connects green crime directly to power, showing how corporations manage to escape responsibility. And Potter frames the whole thing as a type of state and corporate crime, where powerful interests work together, often hurting the most vulnerable people in the process.
And listen, this isn't just academic theory, right? Look at these real-world examples. In Bhopal, India, corporate negligence led to a chemical leak that killed thousands and made hundreds of thousands more sick, all in a poor urban area. Then, decades later, in Ivory Coast, toxic waste from a multinational corporation was dumped, causing widespread illness in some of the most vulnerable communities. The pattern is just crystal clear. The profits are privatized, but the toxic costs get pushed onto the poor.
So as you can probably tell, this is not a simple field at all. It's filled with these complex debates that really challenge our basic definitions of crime and justice. Let's just wrap up by looking at some of these big picture challenges. So here are the core tensions we've talked about. You've got these massive global problems being tackled by patchy, inconsistent local laws. You've got that huge gap between what is incredibly harmful and what is actually illegal. You've got the immense power of corporations and governments that allows them to just avoid accountability. And finally, the very definition of what harm even is can be totally subjective, changing from one culture to the next.
And all of that leaves us with one final, crucial question. If our legal systems were designed for a world of local, individual crimes, but now we're facing global, systemic harms, what has to give? Is it our laws? Is it our definition of crime? Or is it something even bigger? It's a question that really challenges the very foundation of what we consider justice here in the 21st century.